Greetings, my name is Tom Dickelman, and with me today are the Reverend Sean Miller and Dr. Matthew Dewar, and we welcome you to Spirited Take, where we tackle all kinds of stuff relating to life and faith. And today we consider the first of 4 Advent themes, hope. So Matt, you're always adept in offering definitions in 5,000 multisyllabic words or less. How would you define hope?
I'm sorry, were you just speaking English?
I'm trying to do Matt talk so we can get a great definition of hope. How do you understand or think about hope or talk about it with your students?
Before I answer this question, I just made the observation that we're both wearing very lovely flannel shirts, and I think we could start a flannel shirt business of some kind. A fishing flannel shirt business. What do you think?
I think you can keep hoping for that. I'm not sure that's going to happen anytime soon, but it seems to be the season for flannel shirts.
Flannel shorts? What?
or flannel shorts. So all right. So we've got the spirited part down in a spirited take. Why don't we shift to your partner in crime, Sean Miller? Sean, when you think about
flannel shorts,
when you think about flannel shorts, what goes on? No, sorry. All right, so hi, my name's Tom Dickelman. Welcome to Spirited Take, and tonight with Matt Dewar and Sean Miller, we're going to talk about hope, and I'm wondering if Matt Dewar, esteemed educator, has a thought or an idea on how he thinks about or defines hope. Matt?
Hello, Tom.
Hello, Matt.
In the simplest sense, I think that hope is just a sense that the future holds promise, that one's life trajectory is headed towards a place of maybe greater understanding or a greater just total sense of wholeness in one's life. And I think what's most important about hope is that it empowers us and it motivates us to act on life, to be an active participant in life, because hopelessness is very demotivating, and it can reinforce inaction for folks, right. and that's definitely another issue related to hope, but something that happens when people lose hope.
Is that pretty much how you think about it as well, Sean?
Absolutely. Hope is the conviction that it just doesn't have to be this way, whether it's a relationship that's been broken for years, it doesn't have to be that way. Whether it's people without enough food, it doesn't have to be that way. Hope is, and I love what Matt said, that hope is really not just, pie in the sky naivete. Hope is action. And hope invites us to participate in our own hope, in a sense. And, I would say the opposite of hope is sort of, it is what it is. And that's hopelessness. And to Matt's point, in my own life and in the life of others that I've known along the way, that place of hopelessness might be the worst place of all. So hope is that sense that it doesn't have to be this way, and that you're involved in making that happen.
So then does that mean that hope is more than a lens through which we see life, that we have a hopeful or optimistic attitude, that we in fact have the power to increase hope in our lives? Does that make sense?
For me, it absolutely does make sense. I tend to lean into that it's not only a lens, but if it is a lens, it's sort of like glasses we have to put on every day. It's not something that just comes to us naturally. In fact, in my own experience, I was at Beacon Place on Sunday at this great Luminaria event, putting luminaries out all over the neighborhood with a lot of volunteers. And there were people in the neighborhood who came up to us and asked if there were food in those bags that had, a little candle in the sand. And for me, it would be easy to just say, well, that is what it is. But Hope says it doesn't have to be that way. But then the impetus is on me to do something about it. So it's a lens, but it's that forward motion that Matt said that requires us to participate in our own hope and in someone else's, I think, also.
So it's more than a state of mind. It's different than just optimism.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Tom, I wanted to actually draw that distinction before you said that, so I'm glad you said that optimism and hope are very much interrelated. They're kind of cousins, but they're not the same thing. And that I think one of the signatures of hope that distinguishes it from optimism is hope becomes increasingly important even when there are things that we can't be optimistic about. And so hope requires some measure of faith or risk to believe in something, to believe something is possible, some future state is possible when current evidence suggests otherwise. And I'm reminded of, I think it's book 6 in Plato's Republic, where Glaucon says to Socrates...
It is book 6.
It is book 6?
So
Thanks.
Yeah.
You checked right before? It's either book 6 or 7, where Socrates is talking about his theory of the forms.
On tape, Tom.
And Glaucon says to Socrates, do you actually believe that the forms are real? And he says, I don't know. I don't know if the forms are real, but I know that we're better off believing that they are. And I think that's hope. If you have ever seen the movie Shawshank Redemption, it's a wonderful kind of instantiation of that ethos of hope, that you believe even when what you're believing in doesn't necessarily seem to have any reality beyond you believing in it. And sometimes that's enough to get you there. And you see that in the film.
But is that... Do we trick ourselves then into having hope because we know that we need it and we're kind of worthless without it, and so whether it makes sense or not, we just as human beings choose to have hope?
I think it often is a temporary fiction that allows you to ultimately arrive at a greater reality. And without it as a fictional bridge between your current circumstances and the place you hope to get to, it's the vehicle that allows you to get there. Let's just stick with the movie Shawshank Redemption. I think everyone's probably seen it. I love this movie, by the way. It's probably my favorite movie. But Andy and Red tells Andy numerous times in the film, like, stop hoping. It'll drive a man insane, is what he says, I think, word for word. And so Andy's in this prison surrounded by brick and the uniformity of the prison clothing and the dull routines of prison life, etc. And Red is scared that he's setting himself up to just be defeated, but Andy keeps believing. And it's a fiction, but he believes in it so strongly that it eventually allows him to actually make what he's believing in come true. And I think that's the power of hope. Is maybe it's a temporary fiction that ultimately is a vehicle that allows us to arrive at a greater truth, that it actually is real.
That it can become almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, sure.
So in Advent, Sean, we talk about the 4 themes. The first that we're talking about today is hope. Can you talk a bit about faith and hope and how they're related?
Yeah, I would say that hope from in my experience, what I know of the Christian tradition, that hope is this future-oriented perspective, but it is rooted in the past. So in the early church, Christians would get together and tell that story of how God had been present to them and present to generations before them and before them and before them and before them. so that they could go out into their community and tell that story and live that story for the future. So hope for people of the Christian way moves us forward only because we know that God has brought us from the past. So it isn't a sense of, well, maybe someday, so let's hope, or let's put on a lens because we hope that maybe God will do something different in our lives. We believe, and the Bible bears witness, and people have gone before us in faith bear witness to the fact that we have hope for the future because we trust that the past is true, that the stories we've told one another and been told as children about God's activity in our lives and in the world are true. So we hope for that to continue into the future. And I think it's worth remembering that when people gathered 2,000 years ago without an institution, without anything of a Bible like we have it today written down, without any communion or baptism or anything like that we have today, what they had was that story. And that story gave them hope. So Matt's word fiction, I would use, I think it's what Matt is saying is right. It's the power of telling each other a common narrative that gives us that sense of hope for the future.
One thing that happens to us as ministers is we interact with people who are in a very difficult situation or have a loved one who's hurting or gravely ill, for example, and we pray for healing. We pray for healing every Sunday during Joys and Concerns. We're kind of like relief pitchers who are brought in the closing innings of a ball game in some ways, and things are really important. And so let's pray. And often we're praying with and for people for whom faith isn't or hasn't been a part of their life, to give them a sense of hope that things will get better. Is that a healthy practice? Is that practice for you, Sean, problematic? Is it using God for our own hope, or does God welcome that potentially as a starting point? Do you have a sense of where my struggle is or my questions are about that?
Yeah, and it reminds me of so many times when I have been asked to pray in a situation, and Tom, you've referenced this in a sermon this summer at the gazebo, where you're asked to pray for someone's healing when all medical wisdom and all medical advice is that this person does not have much more time in this world. And so as a minister, does it feel false to pray for healing? For me, it feels false to pray for something that you don't necessarily believe in yourself, but what I do believe in is that healing happens, horizontally and vertically. So at that moment, what is the meaning of hope for that family? The meaning of hope is that someone showed up for them and offered time and space and bore witness to their pain and their suffering. That is hope, and that is not any less hopeful than a prayer that prays for a miracle that they would get out of bed and walk out of the hospital the next day. So maybe my answer to that is it depends on how, and this gets back to your question, how we define hope. Is hope looking for a miracle, or is hope taking action in someone else's life to move them forward? And I think as ministers, as a minister, that's where I always try to come from, in a place of, in that sort of top of the ninth moment like you're describing.
Tom, can I add one thing?
Yeah,
I'm
please. Absolutely
not a minister, and people aren't asking me to visit them in these types of moments. But as you're talking, and you mentioned the word healing, and healing and health come from the root word holf, which means to be whole. And so I think in these situations you offer hope for wholeness. And wholeness doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be free of disease. And I think this is one of the things that our culture, with just kind of the over use of technology and medicine and our aversion to death in general, is that we steal people's ability to find wholeness in the human condition. And the human condition is to ultimately to be susceptible to sickness, old age, and death. And that there isn't anything necessarily wrong with that, and that you can provide hope that someone can find wholeness in the midst of the inevitability of those things. That you're not giving them hope that they're going to suddenly drop out of the human condition and miraculously heal, though if that did happen, that's great. But I would imagine that the more realistic and useful target is to help people find and grow roots into their own wholeness in the midst of disease, suffering, and confronting their own mortality.
Right. I think we all agree that there is little life or not much life if there's no hope. That hope is a necessary element in our lives if we are to have this wholeness. Camus said rather famously, where there's no hope, it's incumbent upon us to invent it. And we are in a place in the United States and throughout the world where, in part because of COVID-19, there are many feeling hopeless. Let's close with this question to you both. What would you say to someone feeling particularly hopeless this time of year, and particularly in the year 2020? What can you say to someone, or what would you say to someone who's yearning for hope and not sure how to take the steps to move in that direction?
Yeah. Simply, well, not simply, but what I would offer as a minister is that this story that we tell each other this time of year is a story of God showing up for people who are hopeless. Mary and Joseph were in a hopeless situation. Joseph had some big challenges on his hands. Mary had some big challenges on her hands. And God showed up for them and with them and did something through them. And that for me is a hope moving forward story, that even in the hopeless times that many, in some ways all of us at times are facing right now, God says, I'm going to make a way. And for me, personally, that provides a real hope. That provides a sense of tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow.
Well said. Thank you. Matt, any thoughts, any closing thoughts on helping or things you might say to people who are feeling hopeless right now?
Yeah, hopelessness is associated with immobilization and isolation. And these are two things that are immobilization and isolation are two things deeply embedded in the deepest parts of our brain. And they're very difficult to shift out of once we fall into them. And one of the things about immobilization is it's our oldest response to a threat. And what it does is it kind of undercuts what's called the social engagement system, the newer part of our brain that uses social connection to regulate stress. And so when someone falls into helplessness, they often isolate because they feel immobilized. And the social connection that is so restorative is often ignored. And so whenever I encounter folks who are talking about feeling very hopeless and disconnected, I always encourage them to share and articulate what is the closest and most accessible source of connection that they can think of, and how can they lean into that. And just by having someone help them articulate and identify and start to lean into whatever gives them comfort, safety, and connection, that builds a kind of momentum that can really start slowly becoming a trajectory that leads to health, growth, and restoration and connection. Sometimes you use the analogy of a freight train. Think of all the energy that goes into moving a freight train 1 inch, that first inch. And once you've got that first inch, there's a momentum or an inertia that takes over. And so when people are stuck in that immobilized state of hopelessness, it's so important to find that connection that will allow them to move that 1 inch. And it could be picking up a phone and calling someone. It could just saying to someone you live with, can I have a hug? It can be, it can play out differently depending on who you are and where you feel safe in connection. But just identify what connections feel safe and close and start leaning into them.
Well said. Thank you. We appreciate you joining us for this first Advent program on hope. There are more coming up. This is all brought to you, A Spirited Take is brought to you by the Community Church of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. And if you'd like more information, you can go to our website, www.thecommunitychurch.us. You can also find A Spirited Take on Twitter and on Facebook. And if you're interested or you appreciate this, then forward it to your friends. Take good care, and we'll see you next time on A Spirited Take.